Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the absolute darkest, most consequential chapters in all of human history, the rise of Adolf Hitler. We're going to examine exactly how a modern, functioning democracy essentially collapsed into a totalitarian dictatorship. That brings us to the core question we're looking at today. How on earth did a modern democracy fall to a dictator legally? Because, this wasn't some overnight military coup, not at all. It was a highly methodical exploitation of crises, political miscalculations, and legal loopholes, all playing out over a span of about 15 years. To make sense of it all, we're going to break this timeline down into 5 distinct phases: the Treaty of Versailles, hyperinflation and extremism, the Great Depression catalyst, the legal seizure of power, finally, the horrific consequences.
Let's start with part 1, the Treaty of Versailles, the powder keg.
So picture this. It's 1918. World War I has just ended, the German monarchy has completely collapsed, and this fragile new democracy, the Weimar Republic, is born. Fast forward to 1919, the victorious Allied leaders meet at the Palace of Versailles to decide Germany's fate. And the tension in that room is incredible. You have U.S. President Woodrow Wilson pushing for leniency, specifically because he's terrified that a harsh punishment is just going to spark another war down the line. But on the other side, French leader Georges Clemenceau is demanding severe punishment. France lost double the soldiers Britain did, and their land was absolutely devastated. Clemenceau wanted justice and security. And that desire to punish won out. As you can see, the final terms were just crushing. Germany's army was slashed to barely a police force. 100,000 men, no air force, no submarines. They lose 13% of their territory, and they get hit with an impossible £6.6 billion reparations bill. But perhaps the worst blow to the national psyche was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany had to claim 100% accountability for starting the war. The whole nation felt deeply humiliated. And our point out that this specific humiliation birthed this powerful right-wing myth that the German army hadn't actually lost on the battlefield, but had been stabbed in the back by their new democratic leaders. Which brings us to part 2, hyperinflation and early extremism, the false start. So the 1920s roll around, and Germany is dealing with insane political instability. Get this, they had 16 different chancellors in just 15 years. By 1922, they miss a reparations payment, and the government's brilliant solution to pay striking workers? Just print more money. The result was absolutely catastrophic. Inflation hit hundreds of % per month. Honestly, just imagine watching your entire life savings, everything you worked for, become completely worthless practically overnight. The desperation was profound. Our sources highlight this mind-boggling historical anecdote. Everyday people would literally have to load up a wheelbarrow full of cash just to go buy basic groceries. And if you turned your back, thieves wouldn't even bother stealing the money. No, they'd dump the giant pile of useless cash right onto the street and steal the wheelbarrow itself. In a climate of total hopelessness and starvation like that, desperate citizens naturally started looking toward extreme politicians for radical answers. And right there, ready to capitalize on all that desperation, was Adolf Hitler. He joined the tiny German Workers' Party in 1919 and quickly realized he had this mesmerizing demagogic talent for public speaking. By 1921, he's leading the newly renamed Nazi Party. Inspired by Mussolini over in Italy, Hitler actually tries to violently overthrow the government in Bavaria in 1923, an event known as the Beer Hall Putsch, but it was a massive failure. He gets arrested for treason. However, during his brief prison stint, he dictates Mein Kampf, laying out this virulent ideology that blamed Jews and communists for all of Germany's suffering. The violent coup failed, right? So this is the moment Hitler realizes he has to change tactics. If he wants power, he has to take it through the democratic system itself. That leads us into part 3, the Great Depression catalyst, the turning point. Now, between 1924 and 1929, Germany actually experienced this brief golden era of recovery, heavily fueled by American loans. Extremist parties virtually disappeared. But then, October 1929 hits. The U.S. Wall Street crash sends the entire global economy into a tailspin. American banks abruptly recall all their loans to Germany, and the German economy completely collapses overnight. Millions are suddenly out of work. And this was exactly the emergency the Nazi Party had been waiting for. They capitalized on the misery, promising the despairing public that they would rip up the Versailles Treaty, restore German pride, and most importantly, provide jobs. Just look at this data. The direct correlation between economic ruin and radicalization is impossible to ignore. In 1928, right before the crash, the Nazis won less than 3% of the seats in parliament. But by July 1932, right in the middle of peak economic devastation, they secured over 37% of the vote. They became the largest single party in Germany. The crisis was literally their fuel. Let's look at part 4, the legal seizure of power, dismantling democracy from within. So, despite being the largest, Hitler didn't actually win the presidency. He lost to Paul von Hindenburg. But conservative politicians and business leaders were so terrified of a potential communist uprising, they convinced Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor in January 1933. They foolishly thought they could control him. Just 1 month later, the Reichstag, the parliament building, is set on fire. Hitler immediately points the finger at the communists and convinces President Hindenburg to invoke Article 48 of the Constitution, which grants Hitler emergency dictatorial powers. He uses this to immediately start arresting thousands of political opponents. By March, with his opposition either physically removed or totally intimidated, he pushes the Enabling Act through Parliament. This law legally allows him to bypass Parliament entirely and just pass laws on his own. Basically, democracy voted itself out of existence. Once that door was open, the dismantling was methodical and ruthless. Step 1, he legally banned left-wing parties and suppressed all communist activity. Step 2, in June 1934, during what's known as the Night of Long Knives, he executed his own internal Nazi rivals without a trial, just to secure absolute loyalty from the military. Finally, step 3, when President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler simply absorbed the presidential powers into his own office. He held a public vote and overwhelmingly declared himself the supreme ruler, the Führer, of Germany. The Weimar Republic was officially dead.
And now, part 5, the horrific consequences. The true cost of totalitarianism.
So, what actually happens when a state becomes entirely totalitarian? State policy very quickly formalized extreme anti-Semitism. Following the 1935 Nuremberg laws, which legally stripped Jews of their citizenship, the violence escalated and became highly visible. In 1938, the state orchestrated Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Across Germany, Jewish businesses and synagogues were burned to the ground. 91 Jews were murdered in the streets, and 30,000 Jewish men were dragged off to concentration camps. As our sources state, this was the moment the world looked on and finally realized exactly what Nazism truly was. From there, the timeline just accelerates into utter catastrophe. In 1939, Hitler's invasion of Poland sparked World War II. During the war, the regime implemented the final solution, a fully-fledged industrial genocide, utilizing gas chambers to systematically murder millions of European Jews and other minorities. But by 1945, this boundless aggression backfired entirely. Germany was invaded from the east by the Soviets and the west by the Allies, leaving the country in absolute rubble. And rather than face justice, in April 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker in Berlin. The sheer human cost of this totalitarian takeover is almost impossible to comprehend. World War II resulted in more than 50 million deaths. To put that staggering statistic into perspective, as one of our sources points out, 50 million people could fill London's massive Wembley Stadium 555 times. It remains, to this day, the deadliest conflict in human history. I want to leave you with this final thought regarding that pivotal Reichstag fire of 1933. One of our historical sources notes, in the end, it doesn't matter whether the Nazis started it or not. The fact is, the Nazis used it as an excuse to gain more totalitarian power. It brilliantly illustrates the core focus of this explainer today. When extreme economic desperation meets an opportunistic, charismatic leader, a single national emergency can be weaponized to convince a desperate public to literally trade their democratic freedoms for the illusion of security. So ask yourself, how well equipped are our modern democratic systems to withstand that exact same pressure today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.